Well, good afternoon. I'd like to tell you about the results of the 2021 CRM audit and the richness of data that you'll find in the summary report and the appendices. Just to remind you, the CRM audit looks at procedures involving implanted cardiac devices and catheter ablation procedures. We ask basically 4 questions. Who was the patient? Why was the procedure done? When, where, and by whom was the procedure done? Which hospital and which operators did the procedure? And what were the details of the procedure? And this includes a registry of all the implanted components of devices, which is the only record there is nationally of these implants. And this is the first registry in the world. It's about 50 years old. The data we collect is more clinically detailed than that information available from hospital statistics. We don't collect some data which are better and more reliably gathered by HES, including things like ethnicity, readmissions, length of stay, urgency, etc. We have 3 types of output: the individual hospital reports, which show the statistics for each hospital, data quality, what type of procedures they did of each kind, what their adherence was to national guidance, reintervention rates. These are sent to the hospitals and are also visible to the public on the website as the appendices. We collate the information regarding each operator identified by GMC number. So if the hospital forgets to submit the GMC number, it won't appear for that doctor, showing how many procedures they've done. And we have national data showing national trends for procedure volumes, types of procedures, quality measures, etc. And we publish league tables where you can compare the performance of hospitals and interactive maps so that you can see whether certain parts of the country are having more or fewer procedures performed according to where patients live rather than where they actually have the procedure done. So here's some of the national data. On these broken lines are device implants and box changes, which is the measure that we used to use. And the new implants only are shown in the last 5 years in the unbroken lines. And you can see on the left that the number of pacemakers in England and Wales has been fairly steady in the last 5 years, whereas prior to that it was gradually increasing year on year. And that reflects the fact that our population life expectancy is no longer increasing in the last 5 years. Our population is not aging any more than it was. Unfortunately, recently we've lost the data from Northern Ireland due to data protection issues, and we hope to get that back. And you can see a massive increase in the preceding decade for complex devices, which were fairly new and not subject to NICE approval prior to 2004, with cardiac resynchronization devices and defibrillators. And again, that's leveled off in the last 5 years. We can see nationally that the commonest reason for having an ablation now is atrial fibrillation, and combine that with CTI, which is atrial flutter, and about 2/3 of ablation procedures are performed for atrial fibrillation or flutter, and now only a quarter for the so-called simple procedures, supraventricular tachycardia, etc. On the right, you can see the long-term trends, and you can see that although there was a substantial increase in ablation procedures between 2000 and 2017, that's leveled off in the last 5 years, and there's not really been any major change in the last 5 years. The little grey boxes represent my best estimate of the activity in centres that failed to report. These are largely national private hospitals and those in the developed nations. To give an estimate of the real number. We can see also the adoption of new technologies such as the subcutaneous defibrillator, which is a defibrillator with no leads in the heart, and the cryoballoon, which is a way of performing atrial fibrillation using freezing rather than electrical energy to speed up the procedure. And you can see that the subcutaneous ICD now accounts for about 1 in 6 of the defibrillators implanted for primary prevention of cardiac arrest. And the cryoballoon, which is the pale blue bars in this histogram, now account for about 40% of atrial fibrillation ablation procedures. We can look at whether hospitals are doing sufficient cases to meet the British Heart Rhythm Society standard, which is 80 new pacemakers in a year, or 60 new complex devices. And you can see that most hospitals easily achieve this target, but there remain 25 NHS hospitals, you can see on the right, and 38 NHS hospitals for complex devices that are doing these procedures, but not yet in sufficient numbers. One of the quality improvement measures we have is whether hospitals are performing sufficient numbers according to British heart rhythm standards. And we can see above pacemaker implants, where British Heart Rhythm Society recommends that centres that are doing implants should do at least 80. And if they're doing complex devices, they should be doing at least 60. Most hospitals, as you can see, are doing far more than 80 and 60 of these procedures, and that means that the huge majority of patients are being implanted in hospitals that achieve this standard. But there remain 25 NHS hospitals that were reporting insufficient pacemakers and 38 reporting insufficient complex devices to meet this standard. The picture for catheter ablation is considerably better, and in fact there are now only 4 NHS hospitals last year that reported doing below the standard of 50 AF ablations during the year, 2 of which were only just below that standard, and I think 2 were actually erroneous data entries and didn't do any at all. So that's a very good picture for catheter ablation of atrial fibrillation. You can see the collated data for individual patients, individual doctors, according to their GMC number, how many device procedures and ablation procedures they did during the year. And we're reporting on 1,100 consultant specialists, mostly cardiology and general medicine specialists implanting pacemakers, 500 trainees, and for ablation, 350 cardiologists and 175 trainees. And you can see their procedure numbers and whether they were performing enough to meet those standards. We can see that adherence to NICE guidance has been very good for many years for the type of pacemaker that's implanted. The standard is 90% of your patients should receive the pacemaker recommended by NICE, and 70% of hospitals follow this. And in fact, it means that more than 90% of patients around the country receive a dual chamber pacemaker where that's appropriate. For defibrillators, the picture is less good. It's a newer measure, so there hasn't been time for the audit cycle to be completed yet, but we can see a steady improvement at patient level and at the hospital level in documented achievement of the NICE guidance. Finally, when we look at reinterventions, this is a new measure, I think quite an exciting one. So we're looking at the number of patients who have a new pacemaker or defibrillator implanted, and whether they required a second procedure within 12 months of the first, whether it was done at the original hospital or elsewhere. And we can see that nationally, 4% of pacemaker implants had to be reintervened within a year, and 6% of complex devices. Most of these reinterventions will be the result of complications, so it's quite a good index of complication rates, chiefly things like infection or lead displacement. If we look at the national picture here, we can see a slightly surprising picture that there are some very large hospitals performing fairly large numbers of procedures, more than 250 pacemakers or more than 200 defibrillators, where their reintervention rate is statistically well above the national mean, more than 95% limits. So in summary, well, we've moved in the last few years from a purely registry function to a clinically relevant audit. We're having problems still with data submissions for some of the newer fields which are reporting, although we believe that the case ascertainment, in other words, whether a procedure was reported, is fairly good. Some of the detailed reporting has some improvement to go. The next report will reflect the first year of the pandemic, and we expect to see at least a 10% reduction in the number of devices, and probably a much, much bigger reduction in the number of ablation procedures, which I think have been hit more than any other cardiac procedure. We've introduced improved data submission tools to facilitate completeness and quality, and we hope soon to be able to link to other audits and HES and ONS in order to widen the scope of our audit. Thank you very much.